Welcome back to this week's edition of Mythbusters. No, because Jamie Heineman is going to send his lawyer after me again. My name is Joe Thomas. Welcome back to Freedom and Prosperity Radio, and we're going to blow up one of the big myths here, though, and without actual explosives, unlike the TV show of the same name, because there's one thing politicians love to do. They love to hide behind their somebody else's problem field. It's never their fault. It's never their policy. It's never anything that has to possibly cost them a vote. So the boogeyman that really hit us as the economy started to cavitate was the supply chain. This mysterious thing that, is it a federal department? Does Pete Buttigieg run it? Who knows? Well, Scott Lincicome does. He's the director of general economics at the Stiefel Center for Trade Policy Studies, Cato Institute. You can read all his stuff there. Scott, thank you for taking some time out with us this weekend. How are you doing, sir?
Doing fine. Thanks for having me.
So if I understand it, and I recall there were some voices when they started telling everyone to shut down the factories because COVID. Some people said, hey, you haven't told the stores to stop selling anything, and then those people went away. I don't know what happened to them. Is that what kind of started this, was that we were selling things but nobody was making them, or we're making a paltry amount of them back at the factories?
Yeah, that's certainly part of it. The fact is that I guess in 2020, about 2 years ago, you saw some really radical shocks to the U.S. economy and to the global economy. You had factories here and abroad shutting down, restarting. You had, and then shutting down again. You had entire shipping routes closed as ports were closed for weeks on end. And this had inevitable reverberations throughout the U.S. economy and throughout the global economy. As you said, just because people aren't making things doesn't mean you can just stop consuming things like food or toilet paper. So there was certainly a shock to supply chains here and abroad, related to, we saw empty store shelves, and for a lot of these kind of basic consumer goods. That, of course, feeds a psychological impulse in American consumers, myself included, that we get worried, we start hoarding, and that, of course, just makes the problem even worse. Right. People were filling closets with toilet paper and hand sanitizer because they were worried about potentially running out. And so starting back in early to mid-2020, that was most definitely a big problem with supply chains. And since then, little COVID and pandemic things, again, economies, factories, starting, stopping, workers calling in sick, labor shortages, and the rest, that has inevitably redounded throughout our product supply chains. But as I've written a bunch over the last couple of years, there's also a lot of bad government policy that is not causing these initial shocks, but certainly making things a lot worse in terms of recovering from them.
Well, is this a great example of why, even if you don't make your entire economic policy supply side, that you can't ignore it? Because this almost seems like John Maynard Keynes' fever dream. Give everyone money and they'll buy things.
Exactly.
But we're not making.
Go ahead.
But we're not making a lot of them. Even the factories that were open at 20% capacity because everyone had to be 6 to 8 feet away from each other, and on top of that, and then the food. I think it was Smithfield. Some of these other places were just shut down altogether.
Yeah, for sure. The fact is that, when economies are shut down and people's livelihoods are essentially restricted or denied, there's no doubt that, there can be a role for government there to make people whole in terms of, potential cash transfers and the rest. The problem is that, like you said, the supply side was simply unable to respond as it needed to. Now, and again, some of that I think is legitimate COVID stuff, right? When workers are sick, when it's an unknown virus, you're going to have measures put in place to kind of mitigate some of those risks, particularly given kind of the fog of war that was out there in 2020. The bigger problem on the supply side, though, is that as things settled down, as vaccines proliferated, as we learned more more about the virus, how it spreads and how it doesn't. We had a lot of policies in place that prevented U.S. manufacturers and global manufacturers from adjusting quickly. And where you look at, and I think the most interesting thing about the supply chain, we hear from politicians, this is all a trade problem, we're too dependent on overseas. But if you actually look at the products that are the most globally traded products, the ones that have the fewest barriers to open trade, the ones that are the least or have less regulation on them, those products actually tended to respond and adjust quickly. Certainly, there were going to be shortages at times. That's the pandemic doing its thing. But in case after case, the vast majority of these more freely traded, these products that have few supply side restrictions, bounced back pretty quickly. By the end of 2020, for example, most medical goods, at least the ones that we weren't, again, strictly regulating or blocking via tariffs or FDA regulations and the rest, most medical goods were back in supply. By contrast, when you look at the products that are heavily regulated, that are subject to steep tariffs or other regulatory barriers, it's those products where we've seen the biggest problems in terms of persistent and shortages and the inability of U.S. manufacturers and global manufacturers to respond to changes in demand. Contrary to popular belief, we actually still do make a ton of stuff here in the United States. We're the second largest manufacturing nation in the world, behind only China. But of course, China has 1.5 billion people, and we don't. On a per capita basis, we dominate in terms of manufacturing output. But the problem is that we don't allow or U.S. and global manufacturers to adjust quickly in some of those areas that I mentioned.
Well, is there then a deregulatory process that we need to kind of go through? Yes. Here in Virginia, we're talking about 25% off the top on business regulations in the new administration. Is that a policy that needs to be looked into? Because a lot of people, again, in the myth of the supply chain, point to worker shortages, the 11 million unfilled jobs. And that it's people who have decided if I can choose where I want to work, I don't want to work where I have to get sweaty and dirty anymore, or I don't want to drive a truck. And so we're finding shortages in the supply chain. Is that also mythical?
Well, look, there's no doubt that we have legitimate issues with labor shortages around the country right now. As you mentioned, 11 million job openings. We have over 800,000 job openings in manufacturing right now. And so there are some pretty legitimate issues there that we need to examine with things like immigration reform and welfare reform and other things to get, Americans working back, in education reform as well, to fill those jobs. But like you said, one of the problems we have is that for a slew of products, there's just a kind of impenetrable maze of regulations, taxes, tariffs, and other things that really prevent investors from seizing on shortages or increased demand to satisfy that demand with new supply. And I think, the quintessential example during the pandemic and that we're still seeing problems with is baby formula. Baby formula is almost entirely made in the United States, at least the formula we consume. About 98% of all formula consumed in the United States is made here. The reason for that is that we have very high tariff barriers and FDA regulatory barriers preventing shipments from, say, Europe, which is a major baby formula exporter and a very reputable regulatory regime, coming into the United States. But we also strictly regulate the domestic production far more than, again, say, an economy like Europe. We regulate baby formula like a pharmaceutical. Now, you add on to that, we have a welfare program out there called WIC, the Women, Infants, and Children's Program, where the government further encourages market concentration because the government is a big purchaser of baby formula through that program. And that further limits the ability of new market entrants. So baby formula is where we've had shortages now going on since March.
Yeah.
We still have empty store shelves with baby formula. And that is not a failure of the free market, much the opposite. The problem is that all these government policies, taxes, regulations, tariffs, you name it, have prevented investors from entering the market, whether they're overseas or here in the United States, to satisfy demands and adjust quickly. So it's those types of policies that we really need to have to look at and reform. And it's certainly not just in the products regulation. When you look at, say, our ports, for example, we have some of the least efficient ports in the world, in part because port unions refuse to automate. In fact, the most automated port is actually in Virginia, and it's had some of the fewest backlogs of anywhere in the country. Contrast that with Los Angeles and Long Beach, which, there's dozens of ships just floating offshore because those ports are so inefficient. We also have, zoning regulations that prevent ports from expanding during times of high volumes. We have, again, I mentioned immigration restrictions that prevent new workers from coming in and helping either at the ports and the warehouses or wherever. We have restrictions on trucking services from, say, Mexico or elsewhere, even in the middle of a trucking shortage, so we can't expand those supplies. So it really requires a holistic examination of all of these little regulations at the state, local, and federal level that, in the good times just cost us a couple bucks, might not really be a huge issue. But in the bad times, in a crisis, they kind of all coagulate, and then the next thing you know, you have a major crisis.
Well, and the best marketplace question I can come to is okay, so cab companies had gotten out of touch with their customers and started charging too much. Regulations had driven up their costs of, say, medallions or licensing. So Uber started. Uber came in and said, oh, there's a market for people who want to ride, but they don't want to pay this high cab fare. That's the kind of thing you're talking about, that if there was shortages of baby formula, somebody could say, hey, we could make baby formula, let's fire it up. But they don't do it.
Exactly. And that, what we call that is permissionless innovation, which there is a precautionary approach to regulation in the United States across all sorts of industries, in goods and services, where you have to get official permission from the government to innovate, because there might be some remote risk that your innovation might create a problem. Now that, of course, is a tremendous barrier to entry. And so whether it is taxi services or genetically modified organisms, GMO, crops, or, you name it, the problem you have is that innovators can't innovate because they need the official government permission to do so. And they have to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that there are no risks. Now, of course, nothing has no risk. And of course, the other problem is that the risk of inaction, of not allowing that innovation, can make us far poorer. And Uber was a great example of that. Uber came in and said, okay, we're going to provide this new service. And a lot of regulators said, well, you can't do that, even though this wasn't expressly banned, what Uber was doing. It just wasn't expressly permitted. And so that type of competition was denied for a long time. And I think now we've become so used to ride-sharing services that we forget just what a tremendous impact that had on, the transportation market.
God, and we only have a few minutes left, so I'm going to open a Pandora's box. Isn't that the issue with regulatory capture, is that, what is it? Hoffer says, first it's a movement, then it becomes a business, then it becomes a racket. And we seem to be at the racket end of the phase here of our regulatory structure in the United States, where if I have a radio station, I want the FCC to regulate anyone else coming on the air because I don't want a competition. That's what I see happen time and time again.
Yeah, for sure. And that's, we at Cato, we don't say there should be no regulation, but we need to be really skeptical and we need to be really cautious about the extent to which we empower regulators to act without, express approval from the legislature and to act beyond, in kind of a narrow and confined space. Because, like you said, look, regulators are human, politicians are human, and there is inevitably going to be an amount of self-interest in there, and you end up seeing, like you said, regulatory capture after time. Because corporations, of course, they're going to be self-interested too, and it's cheaper to lobby than it is to innovate, and you can, spend just a few $1,000, $100,000 to capture a market, to become a dominant producer via regulatory approach, and then you get millions in windfall profits. So because of those types of public choice problems, we call it, you need to have regulation needs to be very confined. And we need to be skeptical of new regulation, putting checks on that power to ensure or at least mitigate against capture.
With the CHIPS Act, our Virginia Senator Mark Warner, big centerpiece of that, and the computer processors, there are reasons people manufacture things overseas versus in the United States.
Yeah.
And this looks like a large amount of subsidy to companies that have chosen to manufacture things that are much less expensive to make overseas. Is that the right answer, subsidy or tariff, or how do we make things like that equally affordable here? I've always had this debate about tariffs, because if somebody's got free labor because they have no human rights concerns in some country and they're manufacturing chips, I can certainly make a case that, well, their chips are probably not all that good. But if everyone goes over there, then you're kind of lost in the bramble.
Yeah, and certainly, we draw a line at slave labor. The whole point of free trade is that it is voluntary transactions between producer and consumer, right? So we need to draw a line at slave labor, but cheap labor is perfectly, an economic. It's a perfectly fine economic phenomenon. The fact is that cheap labor tends to reflect not some sort of unfair advantage, but simply a low productivity. And we benefit as Americans, as consumers, as workers, from outsourcing some production to lower cost destinations. And again, I mentioned T-shirts as a good example. That's a very low tech product and is traditionally produced in low income, low cost destinations. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't produce anything here. The United States, like I mentioned, massive manufacturer. We tend to, though, focus on high productivity, high value industries like aerospace and automotive and the rest. And there's no problem, again, having production here and abroad and letting, good old comparative advantage do its thing. Now, with the CHIPS Act, however, the problem here is that global chip manufacturers still produce a lot of chips here. And in fact, they were already planning to invest even more here before the CHIPS Act was ever implemented. The fact is that over the last few years, manufacturers have thought, maybe we shouldn't have so much chip production in Taiwan, for example. Maybe we should have a little more back in the United States, even though, again, we still produce a lot of chips here. So they've made those investments. And essentially, the CHIPS Act is going to just simply pay them to do what they already wanted to do for strong economic reasons. Mm-hmm. Instead of doing that, there are a lot of things that we could do to encourage more semiconductor and other manufacturing here in the United States that don't involve, just throwing a bunch of cash at a bunch of companies that, of course, are making record profits. And in fact, I think the big concern, there's tax, for example, there's tax reforms, there's immigration reforms, there's some trade reforms that we could do. And the problem with the subsidies is not merely that they're going to, give a bunch of, cash-rich companies money to do what they were already doing, but the other problem is that subsidies can actually make companies less innovative. They can end up subsidizing the wrong companies and crowding out the best innovation and investment. They also can eventually lead to new tariffs and trade restrictions as, a subsidized company and the politicians that subsidized it, if it becomes weaker in face of global competition, well, what's it going to do? It's going to go lobby for trade protection. So the next thing you know, we're putting tariffs on semiconductors that, of course, companies like Apple and others need here in the United States to make other stuff. So subsidies raise all sorts of distortions and all sorts of problems that can be avoided by implementing free market reforms that would encourage more manufacturing here in the United States.
Yeah, certainly anyone who's going looking for a new car during this period of time has seen that end of the supply chain. Scott Lincicome, Cato Institute, and the Stiefel Center for Trade Policy Studies there. Read all this stuff at cato.org. Scott, thank you for spending some time with us this weekend.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And thank you for listening this week to us here at Freedom and Prosperity Radio and the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. My name is Joe Thomas. Until next weekend, so long, and thanks for all the fish.